So we saw before how plants grow overall. We covered these terms. Plants are indeterminate and modular. They keep growing and they grow by adding organs. And this was an emphasis on vegetative growth, but the same kind of growth also applies to reproductive organs. And just a little bit of a difference. So when we talk about reproductive, we're talking about flowers and the flowering plants. And the flower is a highly modified structure that, if you look at it evolutionarily, basically is the result of a lot of modified leaves. So leaves, some of them made to produce reproductive structures, so pollen and ovules, and then these modified leaves for attraction. So it's sort of a collection of leaves all together in a very reproducible form. So I'm going to refer to organs as the separate leaf-like features of these flowers, and then all together they would make up one flower. And then again, in the concept of modular construction, the flowers of the same species will continue to be the same. So flowers are very reproducible across multiple parts of the same plant, and then across multiple individuals of the same species. So we got a new way of looking at flowers relative to what we saw with vegetative growth. These are determinate shoots with condensed internodes. So if we are going to look at these and consider them to have organs of different kinds, those organs have nodes where they're produced. And so they are, let's look at these first, the bottom leaf-like sepals right across from each other of the same kind. And the next kind of leaf would be the petals, this orange color feature here, and it's just right above the sepals. So this concept of condensed internodes basically means that there's not any space typically between where the sepals attach, where the petals attach, where the stamens attach, where the carpels attached. All these features are basically produced from the same really narrow location. The other part of this, referring to it as determinate, is highlighted by this central feature. This is the pistil. This is the female part of sexual reproduction. And when the pistil is made, that's the end of growth. There's no remaining bud. This plant can't continue growing from this location. So the flower itself is determinate. There's no continuing growth after flower. So when flowers are done doing their job, they produce fruits, and those fruits can fall off of the plant. And if the plant is continuing to grow, it will continue to grow new leaves and stems from the vegetative portion, but not from the flower portion. Another feature on here, I mentioned the different kinds of organs here. The arrangement is often whorled. So in this illustration, we can see only two of these, but there might be multiples up to 5 or so of these sepals at this location. And if they're all coming out of the same location, that would make them whorled, just like we saw in leaf phyllotaxis. A bunch of petals all coming out of the same place, whorled, a bunch of stamens all coming out of the same place. So this is a pretty typical flower. Obviously, this is a diagram from a textbook, but it's also something you'll see pretty similar across a lot of different flowers. So now that we've defined our whorls, we can take a whirlwind tour. All right. So there are 4 distinct kinds of organs, and not every flower has these 4 kinds, and they're not always as easy to tell as they're illustrated in this diagram. But it's a good way to think about flowers, and in just about every flower across flowering plants, they occur in the same order. So sepals on the outside, petals in from that, stamens in from that, and then carpels, or this female reproductive structure, at the very center of the flower. So highly conserved across all different kinds of flowering plants. So we'll just kind of build up this image, one organ layer at a time, starting in from the sepals. We've got a collection of terms, and we have a term for the organ, like an individual unit of that organ, and then a collective term. So this term in the title part of this slide, calyx, that refers to the collection of all the sepals. So you would say that a flower has a calyx that consists of 5 sepals or something like that. And the individual ones are sepals. So sepals belong to the calyx. Petals belong to the corolla. So same thing, a corolla consisting of 5 petals, something like that. Inside of the petals, the stamens belong to an organ collection called the andrecium. So we're going to see this. This is a Greek construction. Andro for male or man. So this is the male function part. And ecium is the house. So this is the boy's house. And the boy's house are the organs that produce pollen. So they have a filament, typically a slender stalk, and then leading to this area at the tip that's often got these 2 compartments, and then they typically burst open to release their pollen when they're mature. So the pollen is produced at the tips of these, but then the filament can be longer to put the pollen in a good place where it can be distributed for pollination. So the whole thing is known as a stamen. Its 2 main parts are the filament and at the top the anther, and the anther is the organ, or the part of the organ where the pollen is produced. All right, and then at the very center here, we've got the gynecium. So gyno or gyno is female, like a gynecologist. So gynecium, the girl's house, is the part of the flower that produces the ovules. Ovules contain eggs. Should have mentioned pollen contains sperm, so that makes it kind of male function. Ovules containing eggs have female function. And the structure of the pistil is a chamber containing 1 or more ovules. That's known as the ovary. And often a slender portion known as the style. Again, similar to the filament, kind of allows this to separate out in space and make this stigma sometimes farther away. And the stigma is the sticky part that's going to receive the pollen. So pollen produced in stamens from the same flower or different flowers, and then eventually ending up on the stigma. So I can remember stigma because it kind of sounds like sticky, right? The sticky stigma. Pollen grains end up on there, and then the pollen can grow down and fertilize ovules. So there's this term pistil and also a term carpel, and you might have seen both of those. Sometimes they're used interchangeably. I'd say in a lot of cases they're not defined very well. The way I like to use these terms is that the carpel is the unit that corresponds to a single leaf. So again, these are like ancestrally, they're leaves associated with the reproductive structures like the ovules, and a single rolled up leaf is a carpel with ovules inside. And sometimes you can have more than 1 carpel fused together into a structure that looks like this. And then we can use the term pistil to describe that. So pistil is related to the term, or the word pestle. So if you know mortar and pestle, and mortar and pestle, you've got the kind of the fat part at the bottom for grinding. Often see this on a pharmacist sign. So mortar and pestle is a tool for grinding up, and this part is the pestle. So that shape is really what gives us the term pistil. Put some quotes around there. And the fatter part would be the part that has the ovules, skinny part, style, and then stigma at the top. A couple other terms as well. We saw the term for the stalk on a leaf. If you remember that, the leaf stalk was called a petiole. And unfortunately, there's some deceptively similar terms here. Pedicel is the term for a stalk leading to a flower. So pedicel. And this term receptacle refers to the part of the flower where these organs are attaching. So as I mentioned, we don't really have internodes here. So all these organs are attached to basically the same place. That's called the receptacle. Now there's a lot of variation in how flowers are put together. This is useful for identifying them. Also kind of an interesting take on the many different ways you can make a flower. One of the ways that variation can happen is that you can have petals and sepals that basically look the same. So in this example, we've got 3 inner organs that look like petals. They would basically be described as petals, but the organs out beyond them, these are the ones, the ones that are farthest to the outside. They're in the position we would expect to see sepals, but they're the same color and not too different from the petals. So if you have petals and sepals that are hard to tell apart, you can use this collective term tepals, saying basically I've got an organ of this kind and everything's the same. So when your sepals look like your petals, you call them tepals. And this term perianth refers to sepals and petals or tepals together. So what does the perianth look like? The perianth of this flower on the left consists of 6 tepals. This columbine has a perianth of 5 sepals and 5 petals. Pretty highly modified. These are some nectar spurs, so like a little pouch heading back with some nectar in it. And then here we've got some sepals there and some petals kind of coming out in a plane. They're a little hard to see there. But you can highlight maybe features of the sepals, say they got some hairs on them. Stamens. By and large, stamens are pretty easy to identify as such. So they've got the stalk, they've got a tip, anther on the tip that is often has this kind of grainy appearance. So at maturity, they break open and they release pollen out of the anthers, and that pollen is made up of grains and can kind of give a grainy appearance to the anther. And typically pollen is in more of a yellow shade, although there can be some interesting variation in the colors of pollen. So it's kind of a gray purple color on the pollen on these. But by and large, I put this image together to show you that across a lot of different flowers, you see pretty much the same kind of, same appearance of the stamens on those. So pretty easy to identify. Carpels, as I mentioned, ancestrally, these are rolled up leaves. So on the top here, this shows what one ancestral evolutionary original carpel might have looked like. So ovules on the surface, then rolled up. It actually became one of the hallmarks of being an angiosperm or a flowering plant, is that they've got their ovules contained within this rolled up leaf. That's a distinctive feature of the flowering plants and not found in the conifers, for example. So this is one rolled up leaf. You would call that a carpel. And then down here, this is an example where 3 of those ovule leaves rolled up together, fused together to produce one structure. So we've got 1 ovary, 1 style, and 1 stigma. That's a case where you would call this a pistil, and you could say the pistil is made up of 3 carpels. So to know how many fused carpels you have, sometimes you can do a cross-section through the ovary. That tells us here we've got 3 compartments. So the multiples, sort of the symmetry, you see a 3-ness in the symmetry, that would tell you you had 3 carpels fused together. Another useful feature, not absolute, but often helpful, is you can count the number of stigma lobes. So this stigma is split into 3 parts. And that also relates to the 3 fused carpels. Here's an example from life of a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 parted stigma on this geranium. And if you cut that ovary apart, if you took a cross section through the ovary, you'd also see 5, a symmetry of 5 with the ovary there. Okay, so you might have fused carpels, you might have unfused carpels. At the left here, this is actually an example of flowers that contain only 1 carpel, so monocarpous. I don't know if you can use those terms, but you might say it's the flower consisting of 1 carpel. In the center here, this is a flower consisting of 5 carpels, and they're unfused. So they're packed together. Each one of those is a carpel. And then again, I showed you a geranium. This is also geranium family. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 distinct stigma lobes tells you you've got 5 fused carpels. The stigma lobes are separate, but the style is fused, as is the ovary. So fused carpels, we call that flower syncarpus. Unfused carpels, we call that flower apocarpus. Flower symmetry, so the overall symmetry can be bilateral. That means that you can only divide it in one dimension and get equal halves. Another way to think about bilateral symmetry is that there's a clear top and bottom to these flowers. This is often a flower that a pollinator might approach from the side. So like a hummingbird flying in from the side, or a bumblebee or other bee or insect coming in and crawling into this flower. The flower has an arrangement where it's got a top and a bottom. And it's even got its anthers arranged so that they're on the top of this plant, maybe depositing pollen on the back of the insect. Versus we've got a radially symmetrical flower here, sort of a dinner plate, open options for approaching this flower from any direction, coming in from the top, wandering around on the surface. And that whole flower, you could spin it around and you wouldn't really see any difference heading off in any one direction. So again, kind of depends on the pollinators, the effectiveness of putting pollen on the pollinators and taking it off of the pollinators. Those can be selective features for determining what kind of flower you've got. So sometimes it's useful to restrict access. This is a flower that's a little more restrictive. Sometimes it's useful to offer pretty broad access, and that just, again, depends on what pollinators are visiting, if you've got animal pollinators or other considerations. As far as the position of the ovary, this can be helpful also for identifying species, and the easiest way to determine this one would be to take a longitudinal section through the flower. So if you cut it in half in this dimension, you would see where the other organs attach relative to the ovary. So if the other organs are attaching at the base of the ovary, that makes this a superior ovary, right? So it's above, ovary above the other organs, superior ovary. The far side here, this is an ovary that is located under the attachment point of the other organs. So this is an inferior ovary, so underneath the other attachment points. Often you get kind of a bulge here. So under the attachment point of the petals and sepals, you'd see like a circular, fatter part. Under that often can tell you you've got an ovary there. Taking a section, so you took the part of the plant and sliced the flower with a knife or something, you'd be able to see that there are ovules in this location. And that would tell you for sure that this was an ovary, in the inferior ovary position. So those terms are used. Some books prefer to use these other terms that are more Greek in origin. It's a little bit tricky. So plants that have superior ovaries, you would describe the flower as being, in this case, hypogynous. So hypogynous means hypo is under, and under the the female portion, under the gynecium. So hypogynous, hypogynous. Or here we've got epigynous on the inferior ovary. So epi is on, that means the other organs are fused to the gynecium. Epigynous. And then this middle case here, we don't see this too often, but this is what you would see in something like a cherry, where there are organs that are fused to each other. The structure called a hypanthium has a sepal, petal, stamen all fused together, kind of in a ring in 3 dimensions, or a cup. And they're not directly fused to the ovary. So that makes this an interesting case called perigynous. So technically this is a superior ovary, but it's also got these organs that are attached at a location above it. So it's not fused to the ovary, but attached above. Perigynous. I don't know how else to describe it. As long as I've got it on there, next time you look at an apple or a pear, you might flip it upside down and think about it this way. We've got the stalk here. So pedicel leading to the flower. Mature fertilized flowers result in fruits and seeds. So we can see the ovary with the seeds here. And beyond the ovary, there's not much left, but we can see the sepals. So that kind of papery bit, what we usually think of as the bottom of the apple, that's got some leftover sepals and some leftover stamens in there. The petals usually are all long gone by now. But that would tell us the position that they were located at and show you clearly that they're all fused here. Everything is fused around the ovary, makes this one a inferior ovary and an epigynous flower producing that apple. So some of the useful features when you're identifying a plant, being able to identify your floral organs, your flower organs, being able to know the shapes and colors, textures, and number. So just number of organs can be very useful heading into identifying a plant. So this is a plant called Trillium. Trillium gets its name for having multiples of 3 pretty reliably. So 3 sepals, 3 petals, 6 stamens, and then 1, 2, 3 stigma lobes. So 3 fused carpels making up the pistil of this plant, Trillium. All right, so I mentioned that not every flower has the same organs all the time. You can have flowers that are missing organs, and flowers that are missing the male or female reproductive function become unisexual flowers. So a flower with all the organs that we've discussed is known as a perfect flower. Sometimes a bisexual flower, and a flower that has only male function or only female function is unisexual. This is a species that I've chosen to show you that has very reduced flowers. This is one that does wind pollination, so it doesn't have showy petals. Flower on the right, this is one flower, but you can't even see anything except this green organ. And while we're thinking about the green organ, what do you think is one of these has only female organs, one has only male organs? Which one is which? Exactly. So they don't quite maybe look like what you're expecting, but this fuzzy bit here, this is the sticky part of the stigma. So that makes this the stigma. There's not much of a style there, but then ovary of a single carpel. So this is a single carpel separate from that carpel. All these belong to the same flower. So one flower with multiple carpels, unfused female flower. Over here, this is actually the same species, so a very different appearance of these flowers that are only stamens and no carpels. So a little bit tricky, kind of fatter, more colorful filaments than you might be used to. But then that almost looks kind of like a coffee bean with a little furrow in the middle. Those are the anthers. Those would be producing and distributing the pollen. So single-sex male flowers, single-sex female flowers. And if you're coming at this from being familiar with animals, you might have to adjust your terminology a little bit. The sexuality of plants, because they can have unisexual flowers or bisexual flowers, then they can be arranged differently depending on the plant. So we have these different terms: monoecious, dioecious, hermaphroditic. Tell us different ways to put flowers together on the same plant. So monoecious and dioecious are not the only 2 options. I think if people have an animal familiarity, they think it's either one or the other. Both of those refer to plants that have unisexual flowers. So this is a burr reed shown here. This is a collection of female flowers closer to the base. So these are unisexual female flowers. And then these globes of male flowers producing, I guess, exclusively producing stamens. They're located on the same plant. So this one plant is female flowers in one location, male flowers in another place. That is a monoecious plant. So that can be a little bit tricky as well. So just this concept of what, we know mono for 1 and di for 2. See if we can figure this out. So monoecious and dioecious. I don't know who decided with all the extra vowels in these. Dioecious. The aetius, we talked about andrecium and gynoecium before. Those refer to houses. So it's the origin of the word. It's actually the same origin as ecology and economics as well. So one house, two houses. Remember, both of these have unisexual flowers. So the house in these examples is a plant. So a monoecious plant has male flowers somewhere and female flowers somewhere else. A dioecious plant has a single plant has only male flowers or only female flowers. So the dioecious plant, that's most like what we have with humans. Let me see if I can just imagine us a plant here. That's probably better with what I had before. Probably doesn't hurt if you don't know these symbols. These are good ones to know. So that's the male symbol and the female symbol, just like I showed you with the burr reed. So female flowers collected at one part of the plant, male flowers at a different part of the plant, both located on the same plant. Sorry, that ended up being kind of small here. A dioecious plant would have male plants or female plants. So I'm trying to draw mostly stamens on the male plant and carpels on the female plant. So these set up some interesting possibilities for reproduction. Dioecious plants need to have pollen from one plant go to another plant. It can't possibly fertilize itself. Monoecious plant could fertilize itself potentially. It's a big open field of mating possibilities. Take my plant kingdom class if you want to learn more. The third kind is hermaphroditic. And this is actually most common. So this is bisexual flowers. And this would be a single plant. I'm just going to mess that up. Trying to draw one flower here with carpels and stamens in the same flower. So the flowers that we started looking at with those diagrams, those were hermaphroditic flowers, bisexual flowers with male and female parts in the same flower. So this is most common. And this is a plant that potentially could fertilize itself. The same flower could fertilize itself. Where these other ones have at least separate sex flowers, can be an adaptation to resist pollinating yourself, fertilizing yourself. These aren't the only categories, but certainly they're confusing enough that I'm not going to make it any more confusing today. But lots of interesting reproductive diversity in plants. Maybe we'll find some in the field. All right, so moving out in scale, once we've looked at individual flowers, we can look at the arrangement of flowers together. So the arrangement of flowers is known as an inflorescence. And the inflorescence can take on a variety of shapes, a little bit like the reproductive version of phyllotaxis. So we looked at how leaves are arranged on the vegetative part of the stem. And now we can look at how flowers are arranged. Really wide variety. So we've got some, this is just a globe of flowers. These are flowers coming off individually along an extended axis. Can't really see where these are all attached, but kind of looks like they're mostly attached at the same place. Beyond there, this one does a funny spiral thing. Whoosh. This one's got lots of branching. This is a grass, so tiny, tiny flowers, but lots of branching on the parts of the inflorescence leading to those flowers. So knowing the structure of the inflorescence, this can also be helpful for identifying the plant you're looking at. There's a lot of terms and variations on inflorescence type. For my classes, I think it's most useful to know these kinds of terms, just the really basic types. You might see these described in the books that you use to identify the plants. You can have inflorescences made up of a single flower. Those would be solitary. And these are cases where you have several flowers in the inflorescence. And the differences are in the spike. We've got flowers that are sessile. So these are flowers on an unbranched axis without pedicels. Moving over to raceme, this is an unbranched axis, flowers with pedicels. And then the panicle is a branched inflorescence. So 3 useful basic categories you probably see in the keys as you're identifying species. As long as we're looking at the flowers in the inflorescence, there are, sometimes there are leaves that are part of the inflorescence. And I mentioned before, there's usually a pretty clean distinction between the vegetative part of the plant and the reproductive part of the plant. And sometimes it's a little bit more of a gradual change. Quite often, regardless of vegetative, regardless of the fact that we're in the reproductive part of the plant, we can still have some vegetative organs that are familiar. So if there are leaves in the inflorescence, a lot of times they're reduced down. They're not really useful for photosynthesis. They're maybe not useful for much at all, but they're kind of a holdover from the way that plants build themselves. So sometimes you get these little scale, kind of triangular, linear things in here. These are bracts. This is maybe the more common kind of bract. You often find a bract at the base of a flower. Sometimes you see bracts that are modified to do something a little more intense. So this is a bract of the linden or basswood plant. That's a inflorescence associated leaf that's modified into this big, differently colored, differently shaped leaf that actually helps the fruits when they're made, helps them to kind of twirl down to the ground when the wind blows. So sometimes you see modified bracts. If you see a leaf that's part of the inflorescence that looks different than the stem leaves or the vegetative leaves, then bract is a useful way to describe that. So reproduction, as we talk about reproduction, the purpose of flowers is to accomplish sexual reproduction. Pollen gets combined with ovule. That's the same, or part of that process is sperm meeting with egg, fertilization, and a fertilized ovule goes on to become a seed, and a ovary that's bearing fertilized ovules goes on to become a fruit. So here's kind of a more classic example of a fruit. This is an apple developing. No, I'm sorry, I think we're looking at plums here. Developing. And the emphasis I like to make on this is you can see that the parts of the flower, a lot of them kind of fall away. We talked about that with the apple. There are lots of parts of the flower. Basically 3 out of the 4 organs that make up a flower are not really important after fertilization. So the sepals were useful for protecting the buds. The petals were useful for attracting animals. The stamens were useful for distributing pollen. All of those jobs have been done. And the only thing that's left after fertilization is to get those seeds into maturity and also protected, and then sometimes surrounded by an attractive feature here. So sometimes a fleshy fruit, sometimes fruits are not fleshy, but this is basically the result of a fertilized flower, and this is what would have been the ovary in the flower is now the fruit in the more mature version. Oops, sorry. All right, so I mentioned this was a fleshy fruit. Fleshy is one category of fruit. And so this would be a fruit that contains seeds. And the fleshy part refers to juicy, often attractive to animals kind of tissue. So fruits that we're familiar with as fruits are fruits. And also, as you've probably heard, a lot of things that we call culinary vegetables are also botanical fruits. So if you want to make some enemies at your families gathering, tell them how many things are fruits that they thought were vegetables. So this eggplant here is technically a fruit. The basic rule is if it's got seeds inside of it, it is a fruit. So an eggplant is a fruit, a cucumber is a fruit, a tomato is a fruit, peppers are fruits, and so on. And a lot of these you kind of get skewed when you look at fruits that have been selected by people. So like cultivated fruits are not necessarily the most natural versions of things. But they did have an ancestral job to attract animals to distribute their seeds around. All right, so among the fleshy fruits, there are two big kinds. There's drupe and berry. And the difference there is that in a drupe, they've got this stone structure. So a hard stone, just like a plum pit here. And the distinctive part about the drupe is not that it's hard so much as the fact that this hard thing is made out of fruit tissue and not seed tissue. So if you took that apart, if you smashed it well, you'd be able to pull out a whole seed from that looks just like an almond or something. And it's protected by the hard part, which is actually the hardest inner layer of the fruit, so known as the endocarp there, hard endocarp. As contrast with the berry, the individual seeds are not protected by any hard fruit tissue on the inside. It's kind of a hard distinction to make. Hopefully you maybe won't run across that in a key. One of the useful features, I guess, if you wanted to know drupe from a berry, when you get the hard thing isolated, that might be a pit or it might be a seed. In a drupe, the pit is kind of hard to separate out from the rest of the flesh because it all belongs to the fruit, right? So if you get to the middle of a peach or a plum or a nectarine, cherry, you get to the middle of that, you kind of have to claw the flesh off of the pit because they're just attached together. In contrast, if you got to the seeds in this cantaloupe, the seeds squeak out pretty easily on their own, right? So those are actually seeds. They're cleanly separated from the flesh of that fruit. So that's maybe the most useful way to tell these apart. And as I have as a little aside here is that number of seeds is not distinctive. I think sometimes people come away thinking that drupe means a fleshy fruit with one seed, and that's not the case. So you can have multiple seeds, multiple pits in a drupe, and you can also have a berry that's got only one seed. So like an avocado is a berry, one seed on the middle of that, but not a hard endocarp. Okay, so fleshy fruits are fruits, and also these other features can be fruits as well. So there can be dry fruits. So a fruit, botanically, is what's left over from the ovary, and often serves a protective function against the seed. So here we've got a hard ovary wall, which is the pericarp surrounding a seed on the inside. That becomes a very common fruit type called a nut or an achene. So achene is kind of a more useful term. Nut obviously already has a more of a culinary definition. So I usually prefer achene, and I think a lot of your guidebooks will probably prefer to call them achenes, just to make sure that they're being most distinctive about what's going on there. This is pretty common. This one, on the next one over, grain, or more technical term, caryopsis, is particular to the grass family. So we do have a lot of grasses around. This is the kind of fruit that they make. It's a seed inside a hard pericarp, and the distinctive feature is that the seed is actually fused to the pericarp. So if you get like a wheat grain or an oat grain, something like that, you can't peel the seed out from its coating. You couldn't even smash it with a hammer and separate those. They're fused together. And that's really just only found in the grass family. And then finally, if you've got a indehiscent, hard indehiscent fruit that doesn't break open and has a wing associated with it, that's called a samara. So modification for getting blown around by the wind. I didn't define indehiscent for us. So indehiscent means it's not dehiscent, And dehiscent means that it breaks open at maturity. So these are fruits that stay closed when they're mature. So you might think of a good adaptive reason for that. A nice layer of protection kind of goes both ways, right? So if you're a seed and you're protected from the outside, if you stay walled up in that fruit coat, the fruit wall, you might also never germinate. So it's kind of a temporary protection. But eventually, of these achenes, the seed manages to get out and germinate. I've got a note here that this kind of fruit, the indehiscent fruits, typically have only one seed per fruit. And that's related to the fact that they are basically they're dispersed together. So the seed stays inside of the hard fruit wall, the pericarp, and they both go together to wherever they get dispersed. So whether they get blown around or carried by an animal or floated on a river or just tumbled downhill or something, they end up going together. So if there were more than one seed inside of there, they'd all end up in the same place and they would germinate and compete with each other. So it's more adaptive to have them go individually out into the world. In contrast, the other kind of dry fruit category is dry dehiscent fruit. So these are fruits that contain typically several seeds, and they break open to release their seeds at maturity. So some examples here, lots of seeds inside of this plant. As it matures, it dries and breaks open, and they're all made available to get out, and they'd all go their own way. So these seeds, they don't need an extra protective layer necessarily. They can have a hard seed coat on there and still be quite protected against the elements and animals. But they are getting dispersed as seeds, whereas the indehiscent fruits got dispersed as fruits. So a typical kind of this dry dehiscent fruit is called a capsule. So two or more carpels fused together, when they break apart, that's called a capsule fruit. And then just a little bit distinction, the fruit type known as a follicle is a dehiscent single carpel. So it breaks open along one side here, kind of like a purse opening up, and that'll release the seeds that are associated there. So capsule, more than one carpel fused together, and follicle results from only one carpel. Altogether, you can look at several fruitlets being produced by the same flower. So if you've got a flower that's got separate carpels, it typically produces separate fruits. So these are all showing images of one flower would have produced each of these fruits. This is one buttercup, and it resulted in this collection of several individual nutlets, basically. So achenelets or nutlets. And because they all got produced by the same flower, you can use this term to differentiate that and say that they are an aggregate. So aggregate, all produced together on the same flower, but each their own fruitlet, each going off on its own fate. Raspberries and blackberries are aggregate fleshy fruitlets, technically drupes. What you can see on here, these little hairy things on your raspberries, those are the leftover styles and stigmas of those carpels that were separate. You can also see some leftover stamens there, some sepals, and the petals would have fallen off before. So basically any fruit you can make from a single carpel, achene, drupe, samara, follicle, you can make that into an aggregate of that same type, as shown here. And we made it. So that's useful terms for flowering and fruiting.